Welcome everyone to today's webinar and thank you for attending. My name is Meg Lancaster and I'm the Director of Research and Innovation at NASPO, the National Association of State Procurement Officials. We are happy you are here. Today's webinar will focus on the Information and Communications Technology Supply Chain Risk Management, or ICT SCRM Task Force recent publication titled Software Acquisition Guide for Government Enterprise Consumers, Software Assurance in the Cyber Supply Chain Risk Management Lifecycle. The Software Acquisition Guide was published on August 1st, and the documents have garnered significant attention since its release. The guide consolidates essential software assurance guidance and frameworks into a single document and includes an accompanying worksheet that assists acquisition and procurement officials with mitigating risk associated with third-party software. Today's panelists are part of the ICT SCRM Task Force Software Assurance Working Group and NASPO. They will cover the Software Acquisitions Guide's purpose, why it was developed, and how it can be utilized by states to ensure their software is safe, secure, and reliable. Before I turn the webinar over to our moderator, I want to thank the professionals who developed the Software Acquisition Guide for being here today and explaining how the guide could assist procurement professionals with making better, risk-informed decisions about their acquisition and procurement of software and cyber-related products. Now, I will hand the webinar over to Joe Zarzenbeck, who will be moderating today's session. Joe, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Meg. And actually, I want to thank NASPO for basically setting this webinar up for us. And I will tell you that prior to retiring from industry and retiring from Department of Homeland Security, I was involved in the ICT SCRM Task Force with the focus on software assurance. And we developed this guide as a way for exercising more due diligence on the side of procurement to make sure that your suppliers are exercising proper due care in what they're supplying to your customers. Our panelists today who are joining me are, we have, first of all, Dick Brooks, who's the co-founder and lead and software engineer for Business Cyber Guardian. We have Solomon Kingston, who is the Deputy Chief Cooperative Procurement Officer, NASPO Value Points, and Tim Mackey, who is the co-lead for the Software Assurance Working Group. He's the head of Software Supply Chain Risk Management at Black Duck Software. And these individuals have been involved with their groups in helping to advance the cause, if you would, making sure we stress the message of what we can do. Now, we've already had two different webinars on this where we went over why we had this, why was it developed, and then we had a second one on how it's used. So we went into a lot more of the details. Today's focus really is on how procurement officers outside the federal government could be using this to exercise better due diligence in helping their enterprises be more secure based on what you're bringing into the enterprise. So I'm going to start by having each of our panelists introduce themselves, but also in introducing yourselves, kind of explain why you felt the software acquisition guide is needed. So I'll start with Tim, since you're the co-lead on this, kind of give your perspective.
Sure. Thank you, Joe. And thank you everyone for joining our webinar today. From my perspective, one of the big values that we get out of the software acquisition guide is being able to have a visualization of all the interconnected roles that are part of maintaining a software infrastructure, whether that's a single app, a mobile app, something that is truly mission critical, something that is core to the operations of an entity, all under the umbrella of software assurance. So in other words, does the software do what it says on the side of the tin? Does it have any issues? Are those issues being attended to? We all recognize that software that's released today could be subject to some undisclosed but unknown vulnerability that is subsequently disclosed next week. Do we understand how these workflows, how these processes are put in place, and effectively have a mechanism by which we can go and enable the procurement folks to assess in a clean and crisp manner whether or not supplier A and supplier B are on a level footing with respect to what they're doing about software risk and software assurance topics.
Great, I appreciate that. And Dick, you were also involved in development of the guide. Share your perspectives, a little bit about you, but also why you wanted to be involved with this. Why is it important?
Thank you, Joe. And I do want to thank both Joe and Tim. These guys did just an incredibly good job at leading us, and of course Sabine for keeping us on the rails. But Joe is really the visionary, and Tim was sort of the quarterback in getting us through all of this. So thank you, gentlemen. My name is Dick Brooks. I'm the lead software engineer at Business Cyber Guardian. My role in this was really just as a foot soldier to represent the perspectives of a small software vendor who would need to submit their requirements or meet the requirements of the U.S. government. And I have to say that it was really the SolarWinds incident that led to Executive Order 14028, which really drove my interest in this area, because here we were being told to implement supply chain risk management standards and requirements, but nobody really knew what the heck that meant. And so the buyer's guide or the software acquisition guide really fills in the holes that a software vendor will be asking, what exactly is expected of me? And that's what the software acquisition guide does. And our good friends over at NASA have been very instrumental providing resources to software vendors to help them understand those expectations. So thank you, guys. Look forward to this presentation.
Okay, thank you. And I'll let everybody know, Dick was the one who also made the effort of saying, what would it take for me to answer this? Can I answer these questions? How long does it take? And again, he came in from a small business perspective. It was really good. By the way, just before I have Solomon come in, I want to remind everybody that we have chat available. And as you can see in the chat, there's the link that actually provides you the guide itself. You can download that. Also, at the end of this session, we will be allowing you to ask questions, and you can kind of queue it up as we're going along. If you've got any questions or comments, put those in the chat as well. So Solomon, coming in from an NASPO perspective, what's the value add that you see here, and why you think there are some challenges in procurement, but how this might go on to help people?
Yeah, definitely, Joe. And first off, thank you for having me here. I guess kind of just highlighting my role in the process. I'd more or less describe it as the beneficiary of all of the hard work of Joe, Dick, and Tim, and in the team there. In NASPO, as I serve as the Deputy Chief Cooperative Procurement Officer within our Value Point program, really working with state procurement offices around the nation on their cooperative procurement needs for all types of goods and services, notably as it relates to IT procurement. At its core, looking to industry standards, protocols, best practices, recognizing many of our state agencies are tasked with procuring certain IT systems and technologies that we really don't have the subject matter expertise for. And really what this guide has created a framework is being able to pull together on a more consistent playing field or consistent terminology for our potential buyers, public entities around the nation to have some more informed and detailed conversations as they go throughout the initial stages of a procurement process, recognizing at its core, each of our state agencies are faced with the rise of ransomware attacks from year over year. As we look at different softwares that are being procured at the state agency level, software supply chain has been key, and I appreciate the guide's diligence in reference to software supply chain in general, recognizing a good number of our software solutions, they're no longer standalone solutions. They integrate, and it's an area that we appreciate as we see the industry being a bit more solution agnostic. More integrations are available there. There's also the risk inherent in that of ensuring that regardless of you're the front-facing software or software solution that integrates down the road, the guide, as I've gone through it with my own work, working with states, has provided a bit more streamlined structure. That quite honestly, before joining NASPO, I was with the state of Utah's Central Procurement Office, working with the then Department of Technology Services. Would have loved to have a more structured guide to help me in my procurement.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the role that NASPO does, and I know your procurement officers in the various states appreciate that because they're not left to their own. They can look at what others are, the lessons learned, best practices, and so you have a way of collecting that and having to enhance that, be able to go on. Now, the next slide actually shows that there's a lot of activities that have been going on this. So if we advance to slide 3. There you go. As we know, there's many things, and as procurement officers, you've heard about many of these things, all the way from the attestation form, all the way to things that have been out there for a long time, different standards. NIST special pubs are really kind of the guide for many of these activities. And there's overlapping activities, and as procurement officers, you can't just say, oh, do it all. So it's kind of like, how do you hone in on what's important? And that's kind of what, if you see on the secure development attestation form that came out by CISA, GSA has that, other federal agencies have that. Perhaps the state governments will have something like that as well, or they'll just reuse what somebody else has. But knowing that, could you talk about this in terms of how you think the guide helps people in terms of usability with all these standards out there? And I'll go to Dick and Tim to just talk about how the guide can be used as a starting point for procurement.
So, Dick, if it's okay with you, I'll just jump in to start. I think one of the important things that this slide highlights is that there's no one answer. You can go and say, I want to follow NIST SP 853, and that's going to get you some of what could be done. You could decide that you're going to focus instead on the secure software development framework as a software producer or software supplier, and that again only gets you part of the puzzle. The reality is, as procurement officers, there's an awful lot of technical information in all of this, and being able to enable you to take what the supplier is actually doing today, whatever that might be, and get them to simply answer yes or no. Are you doing X? Not worrying about things like what types of evidence might be needed at that particular point in time, but are you doing X? Are you willing to say that X is something that is part of your workflow, part of your process, part of your policies? This is very, very important. And so that gets to one of the key elements that we have within the acquisition guide. We want to give credit for work that's already being done. So if a software supplier has an existing third-party assessment that they are doing things the right way, or they've already got a piece of evidence that says that they're doing meeting a certain bar. So for example, that they've got the CISA secure development attestation form, they've filled it out, they don't have any future actions that are needed to be taken. Well, that should be worth something when it comes time to go and fill out a cybersecurity questionnaire of some form. But importantly, because we recognize that procurement officers are not the uber techie folks out there, when we get to the point of having the overall structure, which is based off of, you've got some governance questions and then you've got 4 control groups. For those governance questions, we actually go as far as saying, you know what? Here's why we're asking that question. And so it's all designed around being able to ease the procurement experience. So, Dick?
Thank you, Tim. No, I think you nailed it. I look at, I look at this Venn diagram, and it really represents literally thousands of pages of information and guidelines. And so if you think of this as like an ocean of knowledge, what we've done with this acquisition guide is essentially created an eyedropper of all that information that just gets to the most critical things you really need to understand and know about in order to meet the spirit of this secure supply chain risk management concepts that you're seeing pop up in executive orders and everywhere. And I just will say, it's not limited. These risks that we're talking about here, they extend. I mean, Dallas, Texas was infected by a ransomware attack, and it shut them down. Our town up in Peterborough, New Hampshire, little tiny Peterborough, was one of the ones affected as well. So it really is everywhere. And so what we've tried to do here is give you that eyedropper of information that's going to give you the most bang for the buck. Thanks.
Yeah, and
Appreciate
I would
that.
add to that, it's also looking at things through a life cycle lens. So you can go and say, here's what the software development practices look like, but what is the patching strategy? What are the deployment requirements? And so we're just bringing all of that together into a single document so you get that concise view.
Yeah. If you'll notice, before I go to you, Solomon, because I'd really like to get your perspective from procurement officials, but you'll notice in the Venn diagram, in the center of that is the attestation form. And Dick will be one of the first to tell you, yes, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient to make a truly risk-informed decision. And that's why there are other secure software development framework practices that are included out of NIST 800-218. It's in the guide as well. But even beyond that, because as we're developing this, we realize that artificial intelligence is being used in development in the tools and stuff. So we ask questions about that as well. So there's a little bit more to that. So Solomon, from your perspective, could you elaborate on how procurement officials could use this software acquisition guide and what minimum evaluation criteria they might consider?
Yes,
How does it help them in their conversations with their CISOs and their CIOs?
definitely. As you look at some of the challenges, and it's been highlighted a bit already, some of the challenges that our procurement offices face is knowing what questions to ask, how to ask the right questions, and what practices already established in the industry, recognizing for many of our agencies around the nation, they may have the procurement authority for their respective executive branch agencies, but may not have the SME or subject matter expertise to tackle the underlying procurement at hand. From my own personal experience, even reflecting back on the use of the attestation form, kind of providing that initial framework and groundwork for what should be assessed for a software acquisition, kind of building out the role and function of the software acquisition guide provides some of the key areas that really stood out to me for a state's application. Is first and foremost, the reliance or the focus that it gives on a risk assessment in helping guide the decision maker at its core, being able to identify and assess certain risks that would be associated with third-party software suppliers, including evaluating the security practices of these suppliers and understanding where the vulnerabilities lie, and going back to knowing what questions, what areas to assess that would be most productive. Another area kind of building off of that at its core is the supplier evaluation, providing that framework for evaluating suppliers based on their adherence to secure software development practices, and ensuring that the software acquired is built with a security in mind mindset from the outset, that it is not that afterthought, and as security is built in right at the start. Life cycle management being a key aspect there, that the guide addresses all phases of software ownership from supply chain management to the development and vulnerability management. Really that comprehensive approach that generally our procurement offices not having that overall expertise, or going back to what questions do I ask, recognizing the suppliers generally, they have that greater understanding of the industry that they're working within, having a greater understanding of the security standards, of course, that they've aligned their software with. In the fourth piece on that item, looking at transparency and accountability through this guide, requiring the suppliers demonstrate their security practices, the guide promoting transparency and helping procurement officials make those informed decisions, knowing what questions to inquire and maybe dig deeper on down the road. At its core, as we look at making informed decision, the transparency piece, one aspect that I'd highlight is you get to the right questions to ask. A time and resources are severely limited within our procurement offices, generally not having the bandwidth to go out on your own to not only research but set or direct a certain industry standard. And so being able to rely on the work that has been acquired here through the software acquisition guide, and from NASPO's end, kind of looking at assessing those best practices and protocols in the industry and leading out at a more collective effort. Kind of concluding there, the analogy that I like to give is that if you're going out and acquiring a folding table, the industry standard may generally be a 6 or 8 foot folding table, and generally a procurement office might go out requesting a 7-foot table. That's not the industry standard. That the 7-foot table is not even generally what's really needed. It's more so that down the road an agency decided you want 7 foot in length, and really being able to align, no, the industry is really 6 and 8 foot. That's what will meet the need. We're not necessarily going to have to increase or drive up costs because we're not aligning with what the industry is providing. And at its core, not is we align with an industry standard or a practice, not necessarily having to defer to what maybe a supplier has developed, but more kind of the structure here established from the software acquisition guide, that framework is developed with procurement in mind. Giving that transparency piece has been key.
That's excellent. And we're going to talk about this here. You notice on this slide we have FedRAMP. I know states have StateRAMP. Do you see an equivalence there? And what's your perspective on how they can use StateRAMP versus FedRAMP? And,
Yeah.
and I'm going to let the audience know why we think this is important, is because you actually get a pass, meaning those who have already gone through a FedRAMP assessment, you've got for moderate, that you can skip all the deployment questions, because by getting your FedRAMP or StateRAMP certification, they would therefore be able to skip all the deployment questions. Can you share how they can use that? Or
Definitely. And looking at even the application of the software acquisition guide, I'd really note that StateRAMP in its application here really complementing the use of the guide here. Being able, I think you hit right on, Joe, being able to having through a StateRAMP, FedRAMP certification, being able to have that leg up in some of the inquiry and questions that at its core are already addressed it further down the road versus without the StateRAMP certification.
so there's going to be a theme that you hear on some of these, that reuse is a good thing, and you should therefore get credit. If some of your suppliers have already done the right thing, going after certifications in this space here, and not everybody's going to do a FedRAMP or a StateRAMP, but if they have, they shouldn't have to re-demonstrate it to you. That's kind of the key of doing that. You can just say, here's my certification, and you move forward with that. So moving forward with that, if we go to the next slide, if we I'd like you to all talk about the accompanying spreadsheet, because we want to make it easier for people to use the guide. And that means not just the procurement officers, but more specifically, the suppliers themselves. And so the whole idea of using a spreadsheet that allows you to say, I've answered this. So tell us how the spreadsheet helps them in answering. Start with Tim, and I'll come to Dick.
Sure. So one of the things that we recognize is that if you were to look at the most detailed level, having any supplier want to respond to a vendor questionnaire with 364 questions in it it's just not going to happen. Even getting to the point of having 64 control questions, that's kind of a middle ground. But if we forced every procurement team to go and take our PDF and then convert it into something else that works, the probability that there would be some level of issue that got created was pretty high. So we decided that the representation of the acquisition guide in PDF with all of the detail around how it should function needed to be captured in something that was a little bit more friendly for future analysis. And so we went with a companion spreadsheet. It asks every question exactly the same way. The normal order of operations is that you start at the beginning, you work to the end. If you jump to the middle and then try and jump around, you can get yourself into a little bit of trouble, mostly because this spreadsheet is designed to just capture data. There's no macros in it. There's no scripts or anything else that would be in the background. And by going from the beginning to the end, if you get to a question that you then get future credit for, it'll automatically gray out those things that you've gotten credit for. So you don't have to go and ask the question again. And when I say ask the question, we like yes, no, NA, or partial. Those are your four choices. You're either doing something or you're not. And if you want to say that we're partly doing something, okay, well, give us a little bit of detail on what that something is and where you're doing a little bit more or not. This is not a case of you need to get the minutia of detail. As I mentioned before, we're not at a point of saying, here's the evidence. This is a data collection mechanism to and effectively baseline a set of suppliers against whatever the procurement requirements might be. And then the evidentiary requirements would come from there. Because among other things, you don't want to be in a position where you're collecting stuff in anticipation as opposed to against a requirement.
Dick, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Thank you, Tim. So I think the spreadsheet is really what I say to people like other software vendors is think of the spreadsheet as all of the questions on the final exam that you're going to have to answer when the government starts looking at your software, because now they have to do a supply chain risk assessment. So the spreadsheet is really intended for those software vendors to understand the expectations. But it's also valuable for consumers too, the people who buy software. It helps them by providing the ability to send this document, this spreadsheet out to their vendors and have them respond, just even if it's just the first 19 questions, a governance tab. At least you'll get some sense on what level of risk you're even facing. And this is the problem is with software is you don't really know how much risk is there because the software vendors don't, just come right out and give you the, bill of materials of what's in there and what the risks are and the vulnerabilities. So what the spreadsheet does is it's really a lens that a procurement official and an organization like our government can use to actually get that insight on what exactly are the risks that you're facing when you work with this vendor and acquire this product. It gives you that visibility and that level of security, at least, that when you look at these different spreadsheets and different vendor responses and products, you will know which vendors represent the highest risk and those that represent the most trustworthy process. Thanks.
That's excellent. And you brought up the software bill of materials. That's very important because for the audience to understand, you realize the attestation form can be submitted to you, and there was never a requirement for a software bill of materials. We all kind of concur that if you can't generate a software bill of materials, you therefore represent a risk to the using organization. So a software bill of materials is very important. And that comes as part of our control questions. So if you go to the next slide, talk to us a little bit about the purpose of the first 19 governance and attestation questions. And Tim, you want to talk about that and how we divided up the document, why those are?
Sure. So let's start with how we've divided up the document. As Joe mentioned, there are 19 governance questions. These are the baseline questions. If you were to adopt the acquisition guide as part of a workflow, my recommendation is start with the easy stuff, the 19 governance questions. The reality is Dick went and did an assessment for his own organization as to the complexity of response to that. He'll get into that in a second, but this is all about giving you credit for work that's already been done. If you have the CISA attestation form, that's one of the 19 governance questions. Do you have a FedRAMP moderate? That's another example of one of the 19 governance questions. Do you have a software bill of materials? If you've gone to the effort of creating a software bill of materials, well, that means something. So that's one of the governance questions. But it gets down also into how you're treating your environment. So does a supplier actually go and within its own supply chain put in place the level of detail and requirements that they're being held to? So do they have a different bar for their own development teams than they do for their suppliers? If so, that's probably something to look into. So let's ask that question. Let's also ask the question of whether, as a supplier, you're going to grant the purchasing organization the ability to go and scan the software for security issues. There may be views of the world that say, hey, under this license agreement, I can't go and reverse engineer or do something to go and look into the software. Well, I want to look at it from a security perspective. Are you going to let me do this? If they say no, that's worth something. That's telling for how the supplier relationship is going to work forward. And so by breaking it out into these governance questions, which definitely fall under this is the minimum that you should be looking at, we then get into the 4 control groups, and underneath those, a series of task questions. And these are all based on what does a software life cycle look like? Because it's not just the act of procurement, it's the act of ownership and operation.
So Dick, if I answer all 19 supplier governance and attestation questions to the affirmative, what does that give me credit for?
Oh my goodness, it covered a lot of ground. Remember those thousands of pages back there, Joe, and those Venn diagrams. It really identifies just the critical path of those things. It gives you the insights on, how much risk you're taking on if you do, decide to pursue a vendor and a product. So it can help you understand many dimensions, and it's really an umbrella. The top 19 is really like an umbrella because it covers all of the subsequent tabs in the spreadsheet, like supply chain, secure developments, secure deployment, and vulnerability. But it's really just the highest level questions to give people a good high level sense of just what they're looking at in terms of software risk, and also what they can expect from vendors. One thing that I think is worth also mentioning is it really becomes part of the record. These spreadsheets become part of the record that you can go back and refer to and use as part of your procurement processes. And here again, this is where CISA provides some lessons learned. It would be good for the states to consider how you're going to collect that information and store that information, but also maybe share the results of your work so that you can tell other states, hey, I checked Microsoft Office and it's okay. I checked the SolarWinds and be careful, you're using this version, it's got problems. So it's a great way to share information and collect knowledge and keep a record of the things you've done as part of your due diligence during your procurement processes. Thanks.
One of the reasons we recommend, as a minimum, looking at the 19 control questions for supplier governance and attestations, going back to the spreadsheet, if a supplier answers affirmative for each of those 19, it grays out all the others, meaning that's all they have to do. It's where they had the no or partial where they have to now look at other questions. But that's your minimum baseline, the 19 control questions.
And Joe, I'll throw another example in there. If you have software that has yes to the CISA attestation form, yes to FedRAMP, and yes to creating a software bill of materials, you've effectively gotten credit for doing about half of the rest of the work just with those 3 questions.
Right. So it's significant and it covers those. Again, as we mentioned at the beginning, that these questions are a great way for a procurement officer to go back to their enterprise risk owners, meaning the CISO or the CIO, and say, are these important to us? That's where you're going to understand it. So a procurement officer doesn't have to even understand the context of it fully. They need to go to the risk owner of the enterprise who understands the context and will tell you these are the questions they feel that you should include in your procurement activities.
And this really refers back
Yeah.
to the Venn diagram where I mentioned, remember I said what we've done here is try to give you an eyedropper of just the most important things that you need to be aware of to help you make risk-based decisions. That's what those 19 control questions are. It's that eyedropper of information that you can use as a starting point. And if you need to dig deeper, you can. We give you the facilities to do that through the other task questions and other information. And if you really want to know what's going on, you can always go down into the SB 800 161 and all the other stuff we went through to try and come up with this fine-grained list of wheat that we want to provide you with. It's just the cream of the crop. Thanks.
Yeah. Great for nighttime reading, right? But again, it's the first 19 control questions under supplier governance and attestations is your way to really get started. So having said that, Solomon, think about this from statewide implementation and use of the software acquisition guide. Following from your previous questions that you answered, can you kind of walk us through how states could use or implement the guide and why they should use it? Or maybe even talk about how NASPO can support their activities in using this.
Yeah, definitely, Joe. And as you look at a process whereby the guide would be implemented there, I'd almost just restate what Tim and Dick focused on as far as giving that good diligence and focus on those governance questions, really being able to help shape the groundwork or the framework for which how cybersecurity may be addressed already by that agency, recognizing the acquisition guide, and to the point made already, really complements some of the existing infrastructure that any one agency may already have in this area. If it's already working through FedRAMP or state ramp requirements within their procurements, already having a leg up. And so just kind of taking that inventory or assessment internally as to see how far along you already are within the governance questions and attestations there. And then from there, kind of building off of that effort, definitely engaging your CIO or CISOs and procurement officers and then the legal team at its core, following the initial assessment of where we're at, looking at a bit further policy development, educating our staff and kind of reflecting back on, again, during my time with the state of Utah at Central Procurement Office and the authority that we held over all types of procurements by our executive branch agencies, including IT. And so bringing the right stakeholders to the table, recognizing although Central Procurement Office held the procurement authority, we did not hold necessarily the expertise in IT procurement or setting that policy. And so having that the understanding of where the acquisition guide, its overall impact beyond just the procurement office, recognizing even the underlying agency for whom the system is procured for, being able to address that as we collectively approach the acquisition guide at a state level, recognizing that the inquiry here, setting that baseline of common questions that the suppliers will be more accustomed to and familiar with, based on the terminology settled there, and then building from there more statewide and even consideration from NASPO's end as we develop our own portfolios, an assessment pulling together amongst our states who use any one portfolio collectively where we're at today as it relates to certain security parameters and standards around a software, and where do we go on the next iteration of that portfolio. So really embedding this guide in the procurement process itself, helping it align some of our vetting of anyone's solution, and reflecting back even on an earlier statement, life cycle management. Many times I see that during the procurement phase, we do a pretty solid job in building out the requirements for such and such solution for a supplier to be awarded. And when we meet the statutory procurement requirements to sign the contract, and now we're on software implementation, the continuous monitoring, we more or less fall short. We fall short in that, and the acquisition guide here lends itself pretty well to continuing those efforts beyond just the underlying acquisition. And that's an area that I've appreciated, is reflecting back on the procurement office generally tasked with conducting the procurement, but the agency for whom the procurement was done for, they then take on contract administration and contract management, and while procurement may have had all of the knowledge and lessons learned from the acquisition guide, is there a good streamlined handoff to the underlying agency to carry that forward? And so at its core, right at the outset, having each of the stakeholders that will be involved in the process informed at the outset, and all in all, really understanding the acquisition guide, not strictly limited to procurement, to the underlying acquisition, but the full procurement life cycle. When you procure to the end of when your contract expires with the software provider.
Yeah, and I would throw in on top of that, this becomes also an opportunity at the point of renewal to say, okay, so what has changed? The original procurement had this set of constraints around it. We understand that everything evolves. Are there areas where things have improved? Are there areas where things have changed? Which is one of the key use cases for this document, collaborative conversation between supplier, procurement, and requirements office to say, okay, well, what does the CIO actually have as their set of core requirements? Do we need to have something that is more stringently evaluated given this context versus something else? And so you can actually start with the governance side of the equation, but then tune some of the control questions to make certain that you're getting a little bit more accurate analysis of what the supplier's capabilities are, or even use that as okay, so you went and said in the affirmative, I'm answering question X. Well, where's the evidence for that? Because in this context, that's massively important to the success of this particular acquisition.
It's important, and we all understand that there's levels of risk. Everybody has levels of risk, and procurement officers may look at their risk, and it's often about, can I buy it for the best price? Not necessarily that it's the most secure product, because at the end of the day, the risk of using software is not from the supplier, it's not from the procurement officer, it's from the enterprise risk owner who's responsible for the operations of the network and the assets of the enterprise. And we want that person to be the one who can make a risk-informed decision. We talked about the SBOM. SBOM is not a static document. We recognize the fact that software gets updated, and therefore SBOMs should be updated. Why do we have SBOMs? Well, number one, from a supplier's perspective, you should really be able to know what's in the software you're supplying. But more importantly, it's from the using side. When new threats are identified, the risk owner for the enterprise needs to say, does that affect me? If that individual or their network team, their sysadmins, if they don't have SBOMs, they don't even know if they're affected. And so SBOMs will say, this is what's in that software that's in your network, and therefore you might be affected, and therefore you have to apply a patch. That's what it comes down to. SBOMs are about really helping the risk owners to make quick, risk-informed decisions. And that's why it's one of the questions that we have on there. Do you supply it? But you also want to know a little bit more details about making sure it gets updated. Not that it gets supplied one time and you're done. That's not the case. So Solomon, I'm going to come back to you again. And I just want you to kind of think about this, because I recognize that NASPO represents represents a resource for all of your state agencies who are out there who are members of that. And what are some of the assets in terms of resources that they could turn to, that as this gets more used by various states, do you collect how different states are using this? How do they put it into contract language so that you can put out sample contract language? What does NASPO do for procurement officers relative to what this is?
Yeah, definitely. It's a couple aspects in that regard. One I'd highlight is our community network. The free exchange amongst our other state procurement offices around their trial and error successes, maybe lessons learned, as they approach the use of this acquisition guide here, and in considerations on taking the application of this guide to that next phase, and looking at what existing structure they already have set up within their own state, and how the acquisition guide really coming in and complementing that effort, but kind of rounding out the network infrastructure that's available to our members there within our own NASPO value point agreements. It's something that we're constantly assessing as we lead out or set out within any one national cooperative procurement. It is critical that the resulting terms and conditions and structure built there can be used by really all public entities around the nation, but really bringing it home a small city or a county in a rural area, being able to rely on the value point terms and conditions similar to a large city out in New York or California, in really setting a good framework within our own terms and conditions, as well as being able to model that in our coordination and outreach with our membership at large. May very well be that a certain control or standard at the national level in our contracts may not necessarily be most appropriate to include on every purchase, regardless of who that public entity is, but may very well be a standard that individual states or cities implement on their own use. And so being able to provide that framework and guidance, I definitely see that NASPO is in a unique and quite frankly an awesome position to lead out in that area, and an area that I appreciate even in my day-to-day role working with members and other public entities at large. But really that role is setting out with a more structured standard or protocol that, regardless of the size that that procurement office is, able to get behind and use a standard that puts that procurement office more or less on the same playing field is maybe a larger procurement office that on their own they wouldn't have the either the know-how or the structure to require some of the questions at its core. You may look at some basic questions in the governance and attestations document, but really driving some powerful information and know-how and next steps for that procurement office to move forward with the acquisition, as well as continuous monitoring down the road.
And
That's excellent.
that's a really good point, Joe. If I could just interject here,
Yeah.
you make some excellent points, because what you're really saying is, you know, do states really need to reinvent the wheel? And the answer, I think, is that I don't think so, because CISA has already done such an excellent job, and some of the agencies are also doing excellent work to provide you insights on what's expected or what's needed by people in your position. To know you need infrastructure. You may need a repository that could keep lists of all the spreadsheets, and you may need, other support mechanisms like what NASA has for vendors. So it's really a complete lessons learned. It's not just about the software acquisition guide itself. It's about the process by which that application, that software acquisition guide, is also being applied and used in cases where things like, for example, if a vendor decides they want to challenge a decision you made, this will give you some information that you could use to say, but here's how we were able to derive our decision based on information you provided. Thanks.
Right. And as we pointed out at the beginning of this, and again, I'm going to remind everyone, if you've got any questions, this is a good time to do that. Put them in the chat. We'll be able to respond to that. But Dick's already provided some additional resources in the chat from what comes out of NASA. NASA's stepped up their game in using the attestation form, and they've got other resources and their requirements that they're now putting on contract. This is the best way, as everyone in this audience knows, that if you want to have the right conversation with your suppliers, it starts with procurement activities, all the way from the early requests for information or quotes, but just so that you have a dialogue with suppliers. And once you go on contract, that's a strong way of saying this is what we expect. And we recognize and appreciate the fact that procurement officials are not necessarily cybersecurity experts. We don't expect you to. However, it's about how do you do your due diligence that covers the space that puts your enterprises at risk to make sure that you've addressed it in contracts. And that's really why the software acquisition guide was developed. And we did that in cooperation, not just with the federal government and different agencies, but industry was involved, from large software suppliers to network suppliers to service providers and small industry who is providing those services and software. So we've found that it's got a right balance. And Dick, coming from a small company, saying you have to have that balance. Do you feel that this was overwhelming in being able to respond to it?
Not at all, Joe. I mean, of course, like you said, we're a small company, small software engineering company. So we're not like Microsoft with thousands of products. We basically have 2 products. And so for us to be able to answer this, we were able to answer the vendor questionnaire, the software acquisition guide spreadsheet in really under 2 hours. And that's really because we have an intimate knowledge and very small set of products to actually deal with.
And I'll jump in as well. So we're a medium-sized business. It's called about 2,500 employees, doing about $500 million in revenue. And the governance questions, the burden to answer those initially was a few hours, most of which was, okay, let's just go and make certain that we know what our attestation evidence is going to be. Even though it's not required by the form, let's go make certain that we've got the right boxes ticked and we've got the right documents in case we're challenged. Because this is now a baseline, the effort for us to go and work through the process doesn't involve our CISO, doesn't involve our legal team. It is simply a set of documentation that we can go and say, here's where we're doing this. This is why we're good at it. The moral equivalent of, and here's my ISO 27001 certificate. We've done the work, we've done all the assessments, we think we're good, here you go. So the cost for most organizations is simply an upfront first time, and then the rest of it's pretty straightforward. And we've got, call it 100 products that we work with.
Right. And I know you guys can also kind of reaffirm this, but we found that with large companies who have a lot of products, we actually found that in their cases, they actually have more standard development environments. Even when they acquire another company to become part of it, they bring them in so that they all start using the same processes within. So processes and practices become more standard within the large companies across the board when they're doing that. So it's not like they're having to re-answer this for every one of their products. Tim, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, the only thing that I'd add in is that for us, we're actually at the point where we're starting to bake this into some of our M&A activity, to go and say, if we are acquiring something, our tech due diligence says we want to know what your cyber practices are. This is a good baseline for that as well.
Okay, that's excellent. I know we're coming up on the top of the hour here. I did not see any questions in chat. This is kind of your last chance to say, raise your hand saying, I've got some comments on there. Before returning it over to Meg, I want to thank everyone here for participating and taking the time, but more specifically because of the work that you have been doing, and from a NASPO perspective, the work that you're going to be doing. And I know that you've got a link. There's another page here where you can go for your certification, your CE certification. But with that, I appreciate the opportunity of being able to share what we feel is something that's important as a resource to people who are in procurement and acquisition. Meg?
Joe, thank you so much for moderating this conversation about the guide. And a huge thanks to Solomon, Tim, and Dick for all the information and the engaging conversation. It's exciting to see how the guide can serve as a valuable starting point for this discussion with cybersecurity staff and enterprise staff regarding the acquisition and procurement of software and cyber products. So again, I wanted to say thank you, stay warm, we appreciate your attendance, and please do not hesitate to reach out to us with any questions, comments, or concerns. Have a great day, y'all.